when I get to hang out with you, I always think to myself, I never thought podcasting would let me hang out with you. Right? Like, wow, that's amazing.
Oh,
So
thanks, Eric. I love the energy that this is, podcasting's been around for, 16 years now and all that, but this is still the early stages. And so it's really exciting.
yeah, it is exciting. I do think that is amazing. And so we're going to talk about some of what you guys are doing because you always have a creative way of approaching it, and we've talked about that before. But I want to share it with our guests, so I think it'll be or our friends. That'll be good. Hey, friends. So I'm just we are hopping in. We are live. We are live just all over the internet. So we are in Christian Podcasters Association and our Christian Podcast Guest. If you're in that group and you want to be a guest, on my main feed, and then Twitter, and then I'm not sure if LinkedIn's working today, but that's all right. LinkedIn maybe took the day off. Who knows? Hard to tell. Anyway, so we're going to get going here in just a minute. In the video, guys, there is a link that has a link in there that you can click to let whatever app you're in, Facebook most likely, know that that it's okay to share your name. And what's great about that is if you do make a comment, or when you do make a comment, you ask a question, I can put up on the screen, which is really cool. So we can do that and have it just say, "Hey there, Facebook user." But that was Courtney. So Courtney, click that link. If you scroll up and hit "See More," then we can put your name up there and talk about what you do, which is always helpful as well. We're going to get started here in just a minute or so. I want to give a chance for everybody to get in. If you're wherever you're watching, let me know what part of the country you're in and where you're watching from. I'd love to hear that. We're both in Colorado. Good, beautiful state. Starting to warm up, right? Which is good.
For a couple days.
Yeah, right. Until it gets not warm anymore.
Right.
It has been interesting. We got a lot of rain, which has been good. A lot of snow, I guess. So we got some of our gold members here. Jerry, what's up, Jerry? Jerry said he wouldn't miss it, so that's cool.
Yeah, Jerry, with the one who sets high standards so you're going to solve all my problems in today's thing, right?
That's right.
Yeah, no problem.
We'll see what we can do. What's up, James? I like it. All right, here we go. Oh, Rob, it's okay. What Rob has to share.
It happens.
No, it's okay. There we go. Got somebody else coming in from New England. And Sarah, what's up, Sarah? Good to see you. Love it. Sarah's a great creator. She creates all kinds of stuff. And Jerry, there we go. Solving mine. All right. I love it. Okay, friends. Well, so how's this works? I started doing this in December. I was explaining to somebody that when I first started, I didn't really know how this was going to work, like a recording live like this, but we've got it down a little procedure now. So we're on here, we're hanging out. Rob and I we know where we're going, and we're going to record an episode of the Christian Podcaster, which will be out at a later time on the audio feed. But because you're here with us live, you get to ask questions. So we're going to have our conversation. We're going to go back and forth and record that. And then when we're done recording that, we will have time for questions. How do you get your question featured? You can do one of two things. Well, really only one thing. Just put it in the chat, right? And we'll come back to it later. So feel free to ask your questions as we go. If you have a comment, feel free to ask that. I like to put those up on the screen, which is kind of fun to be able to have that interaction sometimes. But then we'll come back to the questions specifically at the end, which I think will be fantastic and very good. Okay. So friends, we've got people watching from all over the place. I don't know. Mark says it's snowing wherever he is. That's good. My daughter texted me. She's in Atlanta on her way to Spain, and she's like, "Oh, it's 80 degrees here." It's like, shut up. That's not fair. All right. That's good. No way. Not too bad here today, but didn't want to hear it. Anyway, all right, guys. Well, we're going to go ahead and go. I'm going to hit record over here, and then I'm going to introduce Rob, and we will do our whole thing. So our whole conversation. All right, we're ready. Here we go. All right. Well, hey, friends, welcome back to the Christian podcaster, Eric Nevins here. And of course, this is a show where if you're a Christian podcaster, whether your show is for Christian audiences in Bible and theology, or you're a Christian who has a podcast and you want to learn how to do it better, this show is for you. We're glad to have you here. Of course, we are at Christian Podcasters Association here to support you as the Christian podcaster. We have a great guest today, and I was just telling him it's always a pleasure when I get to talk to him because I never thought I would, who knows, meet him. But podcasting makes all kinds of things possible. I think it's cool. Our guest, he's the executive producer for Focus on the Family radio programs and podcasts, and he does some creative things with it, which we're going to talk about. And he said he's here to promote excellence in podcasting, which I think we can agree on that. Our guest is Rob Kirpatrick. Rob, welcome to the Christian Podcaster.
Hey, thanks, Eric. I just love what you're doing with CPA and all of that in your heart to be able to bring encouragement and really, like you mentioned, keep a standard of excellence for what we're doing. Christians in this media, we live with a higher standard. So let's represent that, right?
Yeah, absolutely. For our content and how we show up, and how do we maybe not get, sidetracked by some of the hustle culture, swarmy tactics sometimes that we get, right? I think you've seen those. I know you have. You've been to podcast movement and other places. You're like, oh, don't do that. Anyway, I think, so that's, I think there's a way to podcast Christianly, and that's what we promote here. And I'm welcoming you to it. You one time, so this is my favorite story about you, Rob, for like when the first time we met at Podcast Movement 19 in Orlando, Florida. You gave me the best compliment I've ever heard that I've ever gotten about podcasting, which was that you could tell that I was listening for my listener, right? You were like, this is a thing. And what I didn't know at the time until we came down there to visit you like a year, or I don't know, sometime later,
right,
was that that's the job you play in the booth as you're listening to Focus recordings, right? Which is
it
amazing.
is. It's interesting. It took some explaining to do, but why are you sitting there in the corner, Rob? Because I'm looking into the studio, and I've got the producer sitting to my right and the engineer the next slot over, but I'm actually shoved over into the corner because I'm trying to listen to the conversation that Jim Daly and John Fuller are engaging with their guest about. But I'm trying to listen as a listener because, as we all know, there's some times where, especially if you're talking with friends, we already know each other and all of that. And sometimes we can short circuit or shorthand something. And wait, what did you say? And if you don't know that, then your listener has now become distracted. And they've actually almost stopped listening because they're like, wait, I don't know where I am anymore in this conversation. And so the beauty of what our setup has allowed me to do is to be able to nudge the producer or send a note into the studio to say, we need to come back to that one and explain that a little bit more. Sometimes we do that. We'll record it later. At the end of the interview, there's something say, hey, when we were in this part, you guys really just breezed through this one section. And I just know that some listeners aren't going to know what you're talking about. So we can come back to that part of the conversation, flesh it out a little bit more, and then in post, we'll edit that into where it naturally would have been. So we're not going to be distracting listeners.
Yeah, which I think is really amazing. Okay, so that was my way of saying this is how I know what you do. But you tell us what more about what you do at Focus because you're the director of audio content, right? Is that the right title?
Yeah. So my job is I'm responsible for all of the audio content coming out of Focus on the Family, except for Adventures in Odyssey. And every time I say that, people go, "Oh, but I love Adventures in Odyssey." And it's like, well, I do too. But that's an entirely different animal to create a radio drama on a weekly basis like that team does. That's really different than the type of content my team creates and all of that. So I'm over the group of producers and editors that are charged with coming up with episode content for all of the shows that we have. And in addition to that, developing new shows. A couple of years back, Focus on the Family really got solid into podcasting, even though we've been podcasting for 15 years now. So we've been in this channel for quite some time, but really starting to see that this really is a growing media type, and lots of people are still discovering it every day. And boy, we should probably be there too. And so let's add that in. So now we're with a lot of intentionality, we're developing 3 new shows right now, hoping to launch first one end of next month, then another one at the end of April, and then the third one probably sometime mid to late summer. But then to get into a cadence of developing additional new shows all the time to keep those coming out. And I got to clarify that not every show is a weekly show. Not every show is a daily show. We all know this. You know, there are some shows that are monthly. There are some shows that are bi-weekly. There's some that are really like a limited series. You know, it's maybe 6 episodes with a deep dive on a particular topic. And that's the beauty of podcasting, is it doesn't have to be any one particular thing, but it all fits.
Right. Yeah. And I love how you do that, because we've had conversations before about your kind of short form, or maybe the episodes are long form, but short run series, right? Where you're instead of just like something that you're going to do on the radio or do something for a long season, it's more like 6 or 8 episodes where you've cultivated something that is available so that it can be packaged in a way that people can consume it, right? Which I think is really creative.
Yeah, I mean, think of like the Mars Hill podcast series and all of that. As that thing was coming along and developing, there were certain discoveries that they made along the way, because when they started, they kind of knew where they wanted to go ultimately, but they were also hoping that more people would feel the freedom to connect with them as they started, and then learned a little bit more about some of the other challenges that were going on. And so if you take a look at what they did, this one's going to take a little bit of a deeper dive, so we're going to release this as some bonus episodes with all of that. Well, we've done a similar thing. Like the best example is a series that we did called No Porn Marriage. And we designed that for a husband or wife who is in that state of shock, that they've just realized that this is now a problem in their marriage, whether it's their problem or the problem of their spouse. They're not comfortable talking to people. They're not ready to tell anybody. Well, how can we help them? So we put out this 6-episode series really just to say, you're not alone. Other couples have gone through this. There is a light at the end of the tunnel. You're going to need some help, but we're here to help. So reach out and give our counseling team a call. And we got a letter a couple months ago from a woman who was about ready to just entirely end her marriage because of what pornography had done to it. She stumbled upon this podcast series and found exactly what we had hoped. I've said, you gave me hope. I contacted your counselors. We're on a path toward healing. That's just with a 6-part podcast series that pulled that off. And God just uses this stuff in amazing ways.
Man, never underestimate the power of a powerful message in a podcast, right? Like so important. I love that. Okay. Well, so what I want to talk about is there's a couple of things here. I want to ask you about consistently great content. I want to look into, because I know you guys sometimes deal with culturally, explosive topics, if we could use that word, right? But really important topic. And so I want to know about I want to talk about how we kind of deal with that as Christian podcasters. And I know that's something other people want to hear about. And then I want to talk about some of the stuff that you shared at Podcast last month now, huh? I guess a month ago or so. Hard to believe. Time just flies. Okay, so let's do that. So you guys have been producing content. You've been doing this for decades now. So what's the most challenging part of creating really great content? And what's something that you wish maybe more of us podcasters knew?
It's 3 words: sufficient. Oh, it's 4 words. Darn it, 4 words. Sufficient but not complete. That's really sort of the goal, because especially as content creators, and especially if you have a lot of information that you want to be able to share with listeners, we can't go into it with the assumption that the listener is as interested as you are. And so the goal of the podcast episode, for whatever the topic is really, is even in that deeper dive, like I talked about with what Mars Hill did and what we've done with some of these limited series, you want to be mindful of sort of the tolerance of the general listener to your show. You always want to have the ability for somebody who wants to go deeper, that you can facilitate them doing that, whether it's find more with this resource, or here's some other articles I found or written to be able to go deeper on all of this. But if you come into an episode or a series where you're burdened with making sure that a listener will have a complete understanding by the end of this, you have now, in essence, created a white paper podcast. And I don't know if you've read white papers lately. They're dry,
Yes.
drier than the desert, and you have to be passionately interested to be able to really pick up and read it. The beauty of what goes on with the podcast, though, is this is a conversation between you and your listener. And that's one of the things that I just remind people of, is that when you're recording an episode, whether you are a solo show, or if you bring in guests, or you have a co-host, or things like that, your listener is in the studio with you when you're recording, and it's your job to be able to keep them engaged. And you get an idea of who your average listener is, or your target listener, the person that you're trying to reach with all of that. And if their eyes gloss over because you're going to tell them everything they could possibly need to know, you're actually not doing them a good service, because they're getting bored. It sounds weird to say that, but they're getting overload is probably the nicer way to say that. They're getting at a point where their brain is not in a position to take in more, but you always have more for them. So find other ways to be able to quench that thirst.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of there's so much interesting stuff there. So one thing is, you absolutely have to leave some room for your audience to feel like they have something to contribute, right? So I do this with questions on the internet sometimes, and I'll say, like, the example I use is, which is better, Chicago or New York style pizza? Well, inevitably, so you get some who say Chicago, some who say New York, and then inevitably somebody will say Detroit, right? Like, so that, didn't even think of that, right? Because you left some room, or they're like thin, whatever it is. So there's somebody's going to have something else to say, and you have to leave some room for that. It's okay to do that inside of your content as well, because it creates that loop inside their head that people are thinking about, and then they're doing some learning as well.
Yeah, you really have to think of it like you are out with a group of friends, and you're facilitating a conversation because you have a new friend that you're wanting to introduce to the group. Mm-hmm. So if you're out to dinner and your new friend, which is in essence your listener, doesn't know the rest of the people, what are you going to do? Your job is to keep them connected and keep them engaged. And if the conversation starts to get into inside baseball type stuff, where somebody who doesn't really know you might get lost, you're going to try to draw them in. And so thinking of the way you construct an episode along those lines, and especially the way you record it, is going to really give you the ability to keep that listener engaged with the content that you're creating.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that. Okay. How did you learn this? Obviously you practiced it for a long time, but do you remember a moment when you were like, oh, let me make sure that we do this thing, or whatever, like one thing took you? Is there a story?
Eric, this just dawned on me. I do have a specific point in time. I was sitting in my office with Dr. Dobson, because I've been here forever. And so he was talking about the format of an episode that we do for the Focus on the Family radio broadcast, the main show, where we feature someone else's recorded presentation. And so he was describing to me how the scenario is, you've picked up this great cassette tape that somebody shared with you, and you want to share it with your friends. So you're sitting at your kitchen table with your cassette player on the table. A cassette player plays tape. Just if there's anyone listening who remembers, and here I'm just letting everyone know I'm that old. So they're sitting together, and you push play. Some time just happened in the time to say, hey, let's listen. I push play. And then the presentation ends, and you press stop, and then you look up and you make eye contact with your listener. And just from that, I started to get some glimpses of there's a lot of things to be thinking about, because from an editor's perspective, it's really easy to say, good, message over, right to the studio. And his point was, no, you have to allow some time for people to transition to the new room, back to the studio from the environment where that recorded presentation originally took place. So from that, I just really embarked on some research to say, well, what keeps a listener engaged? And found some good research that just reinforced what's going on in the listener's mind. A lot of it actually comes from a Nobel laureate, Daniel Kahneman. In fact, I have his book. Shameless plug. Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman.
Oh, nice.
It's well written. It feels like, oh my gosh, is this a white paper book? It's actually it's accessible with what he writes about. But he's talking about how to engage somebody beyond just their, there's two levels of thinking. He calls them system 1 and system 2. And system 1 is just the stuff that your brain is just saying, yeah, that's okay, I don't need to worry about that. That's like, what's 2 plus 2? We all know 4. None of us had to think, because it's hardwired into us. But if I say, what's 32 times 47 divided by 3, if you're really interested in getting the answer, you're going to have to engage your brain to be able to do that. So we as content creators want to engage our listeners' brains at that level. We don't want to have them just treating us as background noise. We want to have them engaged with the content and the conversation that they're a participant in. And so what are the ways to be able to do that? And that's where making that it's called an emotional connection, but that doesn't mean that we're dealing with happiness or anger or things like that. It's just that there's something going on in this conversation that has a resonant quality that's keeping me engaged. I liken it to times where we've been out with friends and the passage of time just goes by so fast. You realize, oh my gosh, it's been 2 hours. I didn't realize it went that long. Or another way to look at that is if you've been out with a group of friends and it was an engaging conversation, but you think of it later and you realize, I didn't really say anything. Well, why? Because I didn't need to. Because my question, as it came up, somebody else asked it. And so, I'm still interested because I want to know about that too. That's what we need to be figuring out, ways to be able to bring that practice into the content that we're creating, so we can facilitate those conversations with our listeners, ask the question that's on their mind, and keep them connected as if they were a part of the conversation that we're recording.
Yeah. Okay, so you shared some of them. Are there other things that we can do to kind of help up that emotional connection that our audience feels to what we're doing? And because this is part of what you shared at podcast, like give us some of that, and what we can,
so
what we should be thinking about.
It really is what's on the listener's mind. One of the things is just, okay, so how do I know what's on my listener's mind? Well, ask a friend to listen to your show and tell them if they ever disconnected. Did I lose you at some point, or did I go on longer than you needed me to? Because we tend to overthink and think for our listeners, in the sense of, you probably want to know this third point from my example as well, and here's the sixth point, and I can go on and on. And like, I got it at point 2. You're now,
right.
You're saturating me with unnecessary information. I'd rather you just get this thing going. How do you learn how to discern those things?
Yeah.
Part of it is just watching your own behavior when you're out with other people. I mean, if we really just overlay that, recording a podcast, whether you're solo voice or co-hosted or a whole panel, it's a conversation that the listener is a part of. What would you be doing when you're outside of the studio, and how do you keep a person who's across the table from you engaged in the conversation? Because you can see when they look at their watch, and that's a clue.
Right.
Or in a public speaking environment, if you're standing on the stage and you're speaking and all that, if you see somebody yawn, that is a brain signal from that person. And you saw one, but there's going to be 27 others in the room who they might not have yawned yet, but they're headed that direction. So it's a signal to you to say, okay, move on, or bring them back, figure out what to do to be able to keep them engaged. It's a real, there's no singular answer, because you're dealing with the dynamics of people, which is all over the place. But that's your goal, is to find ways to keep them engaged. Because when that engagement, when you're that system 2 brain is engaged, you've got them. Everything else goes dim when your system 2 brain is engaged. Think about, we could drive a car and we don't have to think about driving anymore, right? Because that's all been moved up to system 1. thinking, so you can have a conversation with somebody while you're driving. We don't want radio or podcast listening to move up into that background area. We want to keep the listeners connected. Some of the other things to do, though, is meet their needs in the sense of one of the things I tell people. You want to have a listener to your show, when they finish listening to the show, be able to think or do something differently just because they listened. Mm-hmm. So you've given them something to apply. And even if your show is, sharing other people's stories, or Eric, a lot of your shows, you're hearing people are coming on to the show and they're telling you about God's work in their life, and and how He has orchestrated their circumstances, or the aftermath of a big transition in their life and what's different. Well, one of the things you do really well is the questions you ask become my questions. That's what I was talking about when we first met. And if your question is my question, I'm actually thinking, well, what would that mean for me if I was in that situation?
Yes.
And I can begin to apply that into my own life, even if I'll never find myself in a situation like that. Nonetheless, you've gotten me to a point of wanting to think about what you've had to say in such a way that I'd like to be able to really take something away from this conversation.
Yeah, you're engaging with your audience's imagination, right?
Absolutely.
To get them.
You know what? Okay,
yes.
so let's go on a little tangent here for a second, because lots of new podcasters will come and say, so of course I got to have video, right? I'm like, well, sure, video helps, but if you come into this thing thinking that you can't have a show without video, I'm going to challenge that. I'm going to challenge that really hard, because honestly and truly, pure audio well done is the most powerful form of communication that there is.
I love that.
And a lot of that is because of what our brains do. We fill in the rest of the picture. So if you're bringing video in, you have to actually now be adding into everything else you're thinking about. Am I making sure that the listener's expectation of what this looks like is actually what it is?
Yes.
And it's not to say that video isn't a good add-on to your shows or things like that. It is another means of engagement with what YouTube is affording and those types of things. But it's the pure audio directly into my head, you talking right in my ears. That's the most powerful of all.
I think it's maybe a little too much for some people, but think about the number of people whose voice you hear that closely in your ear, right? In your life. It's your mother, it's your father, it's maybe your kids, maybe a lover, your husband, spouse, whatever. And but it's not that many people. It's not that many people. And it's so that, just remember that you're creating that kind of audio intimacy that really matters to somebody.
That's the key word. It's the most powerful, and it's the most powerful because it's the most intimate.
Yeah.
Because your listeners are choosing to let you in directly.
Yes. And so I think use that to ratchet up the level of responsibility that you feel, right? Because you should create really great content, because you are able to connect people to your content, hopefully in a way that they might never forget, right? I mean, it's the same, really, really amazing. Okay. I love all that. The other thing I was really impressed by what you said is there's not as much difference within creating audio as there is in or from a personal context, right? So an in-person context. Like what you're saying is the kinds of things that you do in person are the kinds of things you need to pay attention to in audio. And it's not just because it is audio doesn't mean you can let it just be, or be slack about something, right?
Yeah. Why do we pay so much attention? If you want to set up a nice date, you are going to be thinking about where, you're going to be thinking about the ambience, you're going to be thinking about the quality of the food, you're going to be thinking about so many of the things that become the surrounding and all of that. Thinking about those things in the sense of this audio piece that you're creating, this episode of your show. It's one of the reasons why a good mic is important, because you don't want to add distraction into your content, and you need to post-produce your stuff, but you don't want to over-post-produce it. I mean, there's some things out there that will take out pauses, take out all sorts of stuff. Well, then you listen to that, and then you listen to the real person that just affected by all that. they're not the same people. You know, you've got to be able to, the post-production work that you do can't change the character of you or the people that you're bringing into the show. You can do some cleanup stuff. Yeah, some
Right.
stammers are distractions, but not all stammers.
Right. I take out a lot of that for myself where I'm start a question 3 times, and then I'm like, okay,
Well,
which one am I going to use?
when we're talking about the host, you are the power seat of this entire show. And if you want to even re-record your question, go for it. You know, you can do all stuff.
That's great. Okay, that's good. I don't, on rare occasion have I re-recorded something, but yeah, I probably should. There's many times. All right, I love that. Okay, so one of the things I wanted to talk to you about, and I think this all kind of resonates a little bit, goes together, is the idea of you guys tackle some tough topics sometimes, and you've had issues with people wanting to cancel you, and so as a Christian, we have a heart. It can be, I think, a challenge to show up authentically, to show up as people who love the Lord and love other people, but still try to be faithful to what our understanding of Scripture is. So I don't want to go into politics necessarily,
Sure.
but what's your strategy for kind of dealing with divisive situations, both kind of personally and professionally in content?
Yeah, it is a good question, because the way that our culture today has become just such a morass of all kinds of ideologies and all kinds of truths and those kinds of things. So how do you engage with all of that? And honestly, it goes back to a meme I saw recently. Jesus engaged with prostitutes and tax collectors and sinners, not to validate them, but to call them out. So he went to where they were, and if he was going to be engaging with them at that level of intimacy of over a meal, clearly he was being accepted by them into the area they were. But he didn't leave them there with all of that. And so if we approach these things as us, them, we lose with all of that, because that actually, if you look around, that's been the tactic of this divisiveness that's been going on within the culture. And it's not winning. It's not winning anything. What really is the thing that we need to take into consideration if we're going to be addressing some of these big issues of the day, is to understand, well, where are the people that I'm trying to reach with this? And perhaps they don't have a level of understanding that I do. Well, I didn't wake up today with new understanding. I've had my own journey to get to this particular place of understanding in my life about these issues. And so just being mindful of all of that. I'll tell you one thing we did learn here, which was a huge takeaway, because there was a time with several times with some of these big cultural issues, what we brought were facts to the table of why those issues were erroneous, how they might not align with Christianity or those kinds. You're bringing facts. Well, what you've just done is you've set the groundwork for debate. Mm-hmm. And is that what we want to do? That's really hard to do in a podcast, because your listener might be yelling at you and you can't hear them unless they decide to contact you and all that. One of the things we found that just cut through everything is, let's just bring people on who have a personal connection with the topic, their story, and let them share their story. How did their understanding change as they either became a believer, or they were already a believer but grew in their own faith and understanding for these particular issues? You can't argue somebody's story. You can't call them, you can try to call them a liar, but if they're telling you their story, they're telling you their experience, and you just can't debate that. Yeah. And so if somebody, like we had a guy on in some of the gender confusion issues, and horrible childhood, all of those types of things, and just hearing him tell his story, not at first it would break your heart, but it gives you insight into a lot of people who are struggling in that area today. So we cannot just bash people over the head because they disagree with us. That's not going to win anything. Jim Daly will say, I don't know of anybody who's ever been argued into the kingdom.
Right. Yeah.
And
Absolutely.
maybe there's two out there. I don't know. They'll probably contact us if they hear that. But in general, I don't think that's what Jesus' example is for
I,
us.
I totally agree, and I think it's we all approach things differently, and so there are some people who are kind of a head type that might appreciate the arguments, and that's kind of how
Sure.
they do it. But ultimately, you have to engage the gospel with your whole being, and that includes your heart and with your body,
Yeah.
and all those things. And so, but I agree with you. Obviously, I do my show for the way I do for a reason. Halfway there, I do it as stories because one, I'm not very good at telling people what to do. I was a terrible preacher. I was not good at that. Didn't enjoy it. But so when I started digging into what I wanted to do, I was like, I want people to experience it and experience it through other people's stories so they could know if you're going through a dark night of the soul, God is present and he will be there through
Right.
and at the end. I want you to hear that. So that resonates with me a lot. So one question that came to mind as I was thinking about our conversation today, because I think it's very tempting for us as Christians to be offensive about topics or to be on the offensive, if you will, even, right? When really it's the gospel that's offensive. So how do we
Yeah.
act in the world as letting the gospel be the offense and not maybe our political persuasion or whatever it is? And how do we tell the difference?
It's interesting. You mentioned earlier that I've got some experience with being canceled and all of that, and that upset me in a way that I hadn't really experienced in my life. To be canceled because of, actually, in this case, it was because of where I work, not because I was a Christian, but
Mm-hmm.
obviously, yeah, because I'm a Christian, and that was it was upsetting for all that because if they know me, if they knew me, if the people who were upset with me had a chance to talk with me, I don't think I would fit their mold of who they expected me to be with all of that. And so, in that situation at that conference where I was canceled, I still went. I still went. I still interacted with people, and some knew, and others didn't care, and all of that. But when I had a chance to sit down with a woman who said, "I'm the reason you got canceled,"
Mm,
that was a Holy Spirit moment because I could hear all of her concerns, all of her fears, all of her misconceptions. I could see everything that she was um, standing for. And I respected her in everything that she was passionate about because she was passionate about it. Why? I don't agree with the positions that she had, and she didn't agree with the positions that I had. But Eric, we sat down and talked for probably 45 minutes, and it was the type of conversation I wish any believer out there would be able to have with somebody who holds a different position. And I would say hold a different position both within the fold and outside of the fold because we're not the same person. And so we're all going to
mm-hmm.
have different experiences. But we need to find ways to be able to reach people where they are and let the Holy Spirit be the Holy Spirit. It's not our
Mm-hmm.
job to do the convicting. The Holy Spirit takes care of all of that. It is our job to love, and love does not mean endorse.
That's
And
right.
so we can't get caught up in this thing of, well, if I acknowledge them, that means I'm endorsing them. Well, they'll try to twist it that way. I mean, years ago, the word tolerate has been redefined. Tolerate now means endorse in the culture. Yeah, okay. Um, Talk with me for a while, and you'll find out that I really am not endorsing you, but I certainly love you.
Yeah, and I think it feels like a bit of a needle to thread. I think
Yeah,
as a Christian content creator, but I think if we can find that space, and I love that you sat down with her and we're able to kind of talk about it. And even if we don't come to an agreement,
right.
what we can agree on is we're both human, and
Yeah,
I think we from a Christian perspective can say to ourselves and maybe not to the person unless it's relevant that God loves this person in front of us. God loves all people, and our job is to represent that love. Which at the right time, that may become a discussion about who Jesus is, and maybe it doesn't, and maybe that's not the time, right? You can be okay with that. And some people, that's their job and that's what they need to do. But for some of us, it's okay to just represent that love. And I love hearing that. So, absolutely. I think that was really powerful. Gets back to that emotional connection too. I think just being whole people. Yeah.
It really does. Let me see you for who you are. Let me acknowledge that you have a different life experience than I do. We're still here living side by side. How can we coexist with all of that? And coexist not by isolation or cocooning,
yes,
or those types of things, but understand that, okay, well, you're just not there yet. And that doesn't mean I'm condescending to you.
Right. I love that. So that really is, I've been spending a lot of time thinking about this, and I can't go into the whole thing, but the difference between being an evangelical and being really a fundamentalist, American fundamentalism. Chris Staron is doing some series on this, on truce as well, if you know him.
Right.
But there is a difference, and I think it's time for us to reclaim.
Well, and Eric, let's go back to Jesus' example. Who was he offensive to? The Pharisees and the Sadducees.
Right. That's right.
And so if there's offense to be taken or given, I guess, it would be to those who would say that we shouldn't be out there with the people.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things that we're passionate about here at Focus on the Family, is reaching people where they are and helping them see that the advice that we put into our programs, it actually has a source. That source is found in Scripture. And if Scripture is unfamiliar to you, let's introduce you to that and all of that. But we're going to help you in your triage moment first. Mm-hmm. We're not going to say, well, become a Christian, then we'll talk. Never.
Yeah, I love that. Yes and amen. Okay, friends, I hope that today in this conversation you've learned something. Maybe you learned how to connect with your audience better. Maybe you've learned how to show up and love people who are opposite or have different views from you. And maybe you thought a little bit differently about your content. I think this has been a great conversation. Rob, thanks for joining us and just spending a little bit of time just sharing some of your experiences and your thoughts. People can find you where? I've got focusonthefamily.com, but is there another place people if they want to connect with you?
Well, I'm on Facebook. I mean, that's one place, and all that, but contacting me here at Focus is fine as well. I mean, Eric, I don't know if there's a place for show notes or something like that in the way these work.
There will be, yeah.
With my email address going there, and all of that. But I am so passionate about podcasting and what it is for all of us. It's part of the reason why I started going to some of the big conferences like Podcast Movement and now PodFest and all of that. Those are not Christian podcaster events. Christians in podcasting need to be there, though.
That's right.
And that's because, especially here in the United States, where freedom of speech is valued and all of that, we have a place at the table. And one of the things I've seen with podcasting that I've been this is going to sound weird to say it, excited about, is to see how people who have had challenges connecting with people who have the similar viewpoints on life and might find themselves on sort of the fringes of society and all of that, have been able to connect through podcasting and all of that. And I say more power to you for that. That's why I have petitioned to speak at these events on how to create good content. I don't care who I'm sharing this to. This is how to make good content. And if you're in Orlando, Eric, Ashley, the producer who was along with me, she met somebody who, the great icebreaker question at a podcast conference is, tell me about your show, right? And this woman, her answer was, well, my show's about witchcraft in business.
Yeah.
And, wow, this is kind of fascinating. But if the essence of making good content helps her, great. Because we all deserve a place at this table. I only get a little irked when it starts to say, yeah, everyone except you all have a place at this table.
Right.
No, we've got the place too, and we want to be able to be reaching people and doing it well with excellence.
I love it. So I'm gonna do a plug that I didn't plan, but I am gonna say this. Speaking of coming to podcast conferences, this year Podcast Movement in August is in Denver, right? So This is our
Yeah.
hometown. This is where, it's where I live, and I can't wait. I'm very excited about having all of you there. So if you're a Christian podcaster and you want to go to a conference, people have been asking me, which one should I go to? I'm saying August, come to Podcast Movement.
Hmm.
I'm going to be there for sure, but also I'm having a barbecue that's going to happen the Monday before, like right before all the content, starts. So you should come a little early and then come to my backyard. I'll feed you ribs. I'll feed you chicken. It'll be great.
Yeah, let me just say, Eric has Midwestern roots, and we all know that's good barbecue.
It's good barbecue. It's good stuff. It's fantastic. So I love that. Rob, thanks for being here. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Eric.
Okay. Well, Rob, that was great. Thank you for the conversation. So that is we're still live. So that is our conversation for Christian Podcaster, which will come out. I'm going to have that scheduled. I'm getting closer and closer every week. I've got a lot of other cool things going on. We'll get there. But thank you for that. I appreciate it. And we had some good questions. And so I wanted to go back through a few of those. Sarah asked this one. What do you think about static videos with audio only? Because we were talking about video versus audio.
It's really interesting, and especially as YouTube is becoming more podcast friendly and all of that. It depends on who you talk to. People would cite research. I have yet to really find that research, but would say, answer the question, how do you listen to podcasts? And they would say YouTube. And it seems as though that there's a lot of people who use YouTube for podcasts.
Right.
Now, I would say that it's the convenience of YouTube. I'm using it for other stuff. And if I can find shows that I like on YouTube as well, great. That's one less app for me to manage. But there's a current benefit that YouTube offers, and that's the comment thread, similar to what we have in this video feed here, to see some engagement with other listeners and with the show's hosts and things like that. And the other thing, honestly, people aren't watching YouTube except for the short stuff.
Right.
People are not staring at their computer screens or their devices for 3.5 hours to watch Joe Rogan. They minimize it. And so they might pop in when something gets really interesting. So there's some added value for video being a part of your stuff. But the static image, it's functional because it's a way to get you onto the YouTube platform. There are people there who might not yet have found podcasting or want to keep things simple for them. So I think there's value in doing that. And especially as YouTube is starting to even create its own podcast channel now.
Yep.
I think that's only opening up more avenues for us to be able to distribute our content farther and wider. So I think it's fine. I've never heard a listener say, actually some will say, I wish I could watch you, but those tend to be your super fans. And that would be cool, but it's not like they're going to stop listening just because they can't watch.
Yep. Yeah, I like that a lot. I think for me, the conventional wisdom has always been that I'd heard was YouTube static images doesn't work and YouTube doesn't like them. But then I talked to Rob Walsh at PodFest, and he was like, "That's never been the case." I was like, "Well, how come somebody told me that?" So
I think it's because how much pressure have you gotten to get into YouTube because of the monetization?
Right. Yep.
For all of that. And so certainly if you're thinking, yes, I'm going to use the static image podcast and get monetization out of that from YouTube's ad placement, you're going to have a ton of listeners to be able to pull that off. Right. But so if somebody is thinking that the answer to YouTube is purely because of the ads that Google inserts into there and the potential for some revenue coming from all of that, then of course they're going to discourage the static image stuff. But like you were saying, Eric, from hearing from Rob, it's not an issue really.
Right. Yeah, I agree. I don't think it is that big a deal. So here's what the other thing I meant to say this during our recording, but that's okay. I think I don't encourage podcasters to start with video unless they're like already good at it. Go ahead and start with the audio, get good at it. Do 100 episodes, right? Get really good at it. Figure it out. Get your process down. And once you have that down for like, okay, I could make a podcast episode in my sleep, then add skills, right? So iterate is what I always say. I learned that from my coach. So iterate and then add things. And video might be a good one. I love what Tim Winders did at Seek Go Create. He recorded his YouTube for a year, his interviews, and didn't release them until he started to be ready for that, right? To start the YouTube channel, but he had them. So you could do that as well. But don't put that extra pressure on yourself if you don't have to.
Exactly.
Yeah. I think that's good. This was a comment about being a radio guy, loving the power and intimacy of audio. I think that's great. Let's see if there were any other questions. Friends, we do have time for questions if you want to ask some. Let's see what else we have. People told us it was beautiful where they are. That's good.
Yeah, just rubbing it in.
I know.
Although
terrible.
today's really nice. Today's really nice, just a little windy.
That's right. It's not bad in Colorado today. Let me see. So we had a couple of questions that I'll see if we answered these. Let me go in here and
let's look at what was submitted on Facebook.
A few questions.
First, I need to know if I need to hear from Jerry if I've solved all his
Yes.
problems.
Jerry, are you well? Did we fix everything for you? Is everything good? Okay, so Ginger asked if it would be available later. I said, yeah, it will. So Lorianne said, what type of content approach best serves your audience while growing it at the same time? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I think if from the get-go, you're demonstrating that you're having a conversation that the listener is a part of, and what you're talking about has that emotional resonance with them, they're going to stick around, and then the other thing that, in fact, we were just talking about this earlier today. I was in a meeting with our marketing team, and they're just saying, as your show grows and all of that, be mindful that there's a new listener coming in every day. Mm-hmm. And so, yes, there's probably some things that might be, if there's some inside jokes or things like that, if you do your show with somebody else, and a new listener is going to kind of figure out, oh, yeah, I don't know them enough, they don't know me enough yet for me to really understand that. But that's it's not from an exclusion standpoint. It's just like, oh, they're laughing at something I don't really understand. But if you're describing some of the ways to interact with you, don't just say, yeah, check us out on X, or, like the specific instance here came about where the folks from the marketing team mentioned, you had one episode where one of your hosts mentioned your counseling services, the counseling that we have here, but she didn't explain what that was. She just said, yeah, like our counselors. And we have a whole team of counselors here that are talking to people all the time, and anybody can set up a time to be able to talk with all of them. So we've got to find ways to always be mindful that a new listener is coming in and not bore the ongoing listener, because there is a tolerance. People will understand that. I mean, I think of the way, like when Adam Curry describes value for value every episode, he does it in different ways and all of that, but clearly he's describing what value for value is, how the No Agenda Show generates revenue and all of that. And I don't skip it. Why? Yeah. Because this does it in a way that is engaging.
Yep. I was telling somebody today about having because you have your pillars of your content, right? So you have your value proposition, you have the ways that you deliver those things, and you probably have some sayings that go with that, right? So I've got a number of them. Those sayings you should repeat, and those are the things that they may be old hat for you, whether it's from everything from your tagline to all the parts of your message, but some that you're ingraining them in the minds of your audience, right? You're putting them in there so that they get it. And there's nothing like being an audience member where you go, oh, I know what they're going to say, right? But like, I'll give you want to hear this is an example from Podfest. Michael O'Neill, who gave a keynote. Do you know him? Solopreneur Hour. I used to listen to him all the time I call it bank jail, back in my office when I worked at the bank. And but even his presentation, I haven't listened to maybe for 5 years, very regularly, but his presentation, he had all kinds of things that he regularly says that I recognize. I was like, oh, I know where he's going with that. Yep, he did. I know where he's going with that because I'm in his audience, right? And I know what he's going to say, but I didn't mind hearing it again because I was happy to hear it.
Yeah. So from that growth standpoint, you want to be aware that new listeners are coming in all the time. Even if it's one, it's still a new listener. So mindful of that, but from the get-go, if the structure, the philosophy, the strategy for your show is clear for you, so you can figure out what your next episodes are going to be, planning them out and not pod fade as a result, and the energy associated with all of that, that's going to draw somebody in. I mean, this is different than generating awareness for the show, because that's, you really want to ask your listeners to help with that. Word of mouth is still the most popular form, the most powerful form of getting more people aware of your show with all of that. But then as people come in, they feel welcome, they feel heard, they feel valued, and they're walking away from that episode with something that they can think or do differently just from listening. And if there really is an opportunity for them to go deeper with a resource, an article, or something like that, you have facilitated their way to be able to obtain that. Now they're building trust in you. You're becoming reliable for them. And so that friendship, that relationship is being nourished through each episode, and you've got a faithful listener over time.
Yeah. I love that. Think about it relationally. I think that's what we talked about too, right? Think about it relationally. Even though you can't see that other person, they are there. And so
I mean, I tell people, even, if it really, if that's such a mind stretcher to figure out, then find a friend who's willing to help you out and have them sit across from you, even if they say nothing, and talk to them.
Yep.
Talk to them, tell them what you have planned for the episode. You get the opportunity to see if their eyes glaze over. I probably need to figure out how to bring them back. And then, of course, you always edit that part out. But, you're the people who care about you, the people that you trust, will be willing to help you figure this out and make it better.
I love that. I think that's good. I always keep a empty chair in my office where that's where the listener sits. So when I start to talk to the listener, that's where I'm directing my attention, which, on Zoom, my guests can tell, but nobody else can. So one more question I want to answer, and then we can wrap up. But Sarah asked about Gen Z. So she
oh, that's right,
wants to know about the felt needs that you're seeing from listeners and followers of Focus, and then particularly with Gen Z, because it is interesting that this is, they're different, and they're grown up quite different than we did, right? They don't have rotary phones. They've got, Star Trek in their pocket. And so it's a different world for them.
Yeah. I mean, finding the research or the things about just understanding what their expectations are. I mean, first of all, their patience level is like nothing. And so to try to get a Gen Z audience member interested, that's a big hill to climb. It's not it's not unable to be accomplished, but it's a very different approach, because it would be like trying to keep your teenager's attention and all that. Once you get it, you've got it.
Yep.
But not really. You have to get it again the next time.
Right.
And every episode is a brand new thing. I mean, it's we don't have any content right now that is connecting with them just yet. We're actually talking to their parents, and the parents are freaking out because this is just so weird. Yeah. And I'm hiring Gen Z employees because they're coming out of college now. And let me tell you, managing a Gen Z employee is an entirely different experience than everyone else, because they want to know how their needs are going to be met. Oh, and I'm like, well, you came here to do a job for Focus. It's kind of not about you, really, but okay. We'll find ways to be able to, so I can hear what you have to say, help you see the aspirational aspect of what's going on here, and keep your sights raised with all of that to I don't know if they're going to, I don't mean this to be disrespectful. I don't know if they're going to mature as they get further along in their own lives and marry and begin to have children, because it tends to change people's convictions about a lot of things and all that. They haven't all been around enough for the research to be done on that level, but I can just tell you, if there's research on reaching Gen Z, find it, read it, absorb it, and figure out if that's something that is an addition to the show that you're doing, if you're trying to reach into that audience with your current show, it might be that it's a different show entirely.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that could be. Okay, well, so Jerry wanted to know if we were going to solve all his problems. Here's what he said. He said he's taken over a third world island as we speak. So I don't know what that means. Apparently we were really good. I think I'm going to take it as that, Rob. I think.
Yeah, and where's that island? I mean, it's going to be snowing here later this week. Maybe that island would be a great place.
No doubt. All right, Sarah's looking at cassette tapes. So let's see. The only thing I know is that my show on Spotify reaches Gen Z. That's awesome. I think that's fantastic.
Hey, Sarah, then do this. Find some ways to ask them. This is the other thing that people just don't think that you can do. You can ask your audience for feedback. Who's the guy who used to work with Tom Webster? Is that the name?
Yeah, I think so.
On his website, he put together sort of a boilerplate survey that you can send out to your listeners and just say, tell me what you're thinking and all of that. And to hear from your audience is tremendously valuable.
No doubt.
You have to take it with a grain of salt because sometimes people, they've got an axe to grind and they think you should be doing things differently. So there's always that, how much do I need to listen to what's being said? But if you start to see a similar recommendation or similar observation coming from different sources, then you start to get a takeaway that you can begin to apply.
Yes. The other book that I really love is Ryan Levesque's book, Ask, which he gets a little deep into spreadsheets and stuff like that. But he was one of the guys who was like, hey, on it. But the book is free, but then for $9 he'll send it to you or whatever. One of those guys. But he's really good about asking about your audience to figure out what they need. So with that, I think we'll leave it there. Thanks, guys. I appreciate it. Rob. Thank you so much. I appreciate you as always. Keep up the good work. If we can help in any way, let us know.
Good deal. Thanks so much.
Yep. Bye, guys.
Bye-bye.